Hello, Dr. Keller. Thank you for coming on the PCOS and Nutrition podcast today. I'm really looking forward to delving into the interview and our discussion. So in today's episode, we will be talking all about PCOS and gut health, but we will be addressing small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, also known as SIBO more specifically. And we will be identifying the possible connection between SIBO and PCOS. So thank you again for taking the time out of your day to come on the podcast. So before we begin delving into the topic at hand, can you first start by sharing your journey and your story?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to. So I am, quite frankly, I'm a textbook SIBO patient. I am a product of the 70s, where when I was a screaming child and my ears got red, the doctor said, oh, she must have an ear infection. So I was given antibiotics during that time frame of, it was what was helping people at the time, right? So there's just these things happen, these trends happen in medicine. However, then my mother went to a doctor who looked into my ears and said, she's just got red ears because she's screaming, and so that was like my last, no more antibiotics. Then subsequently, as a child, I struggled with weight. I struggled into my pubescent years with irregularity of periods. I was at a student government conference where I was voted most likely to be found under a rock, if you can believe they actually had that category.
Wow.
So I was clearly not myself, okay, because it was this like, yay, student government, there's super personalities there. And as I was getting onto the airplane, finally at the end of this conference, even the pilot had to come out and say, they thought I was having an appendicitis. Turned out I was having an ovarian cyst rupture, and I insisted on getting on the airplane. My mother, I grew up in a small Southeast Alaska. My mother actually had to fly to the Juneau where I was flying in from Anchorage. And that was my first experience with the transvaginal ultrasound, all of that. I'm 16 going, what? And so they just assumed, and this was also in the 90s during a time frame where they're like, what is this? I have blonde hair, so I did have some hair on my face, and I hadn't quite cycled yet. So I was this syndrome they picked up. Well, what do you know? Right alongside that, I also had IBS. I'm 16. My mom asks me about everything because she was very alternative. Asked me when the last time I had a bowel movement was, and I said, no, I don't know, about a month ago. And she just about fell over. And she rushed to the phone. Again, I'm in rural Alaska. She calls down where she had herbs and fiber and everything flown up to our small little town. And I started taking these things. I felt horrible. I felt bad because my mom spent all this money. I'm doing everything that everybody said to do. And meanwhile, I start to get acne. I'm just this perfect picture. And the acne was horrible. So I'm then now on antibiotics, even setting a timer in the middle of the night to take my good old tetracycline. Right? And you're looking for that to be the cure. They suggested all these birth control pills. I wasn't sexually active. Not a single birth control worked for me. Even when orthotricycline came out, that made it worse. So that's where now looking back, I was like, wow, I had the SIBO overlap. I wasn't cycling properly. I had headaches that I was blacking out in college. They thought I might have meningitis. And so, it's like IBS and acne, those things kind of go to the side. But instead of taking internal antibiotics, I will say this, I had access to a topical clindamycin, and thankfully I switched over to that and stopped taking it. And just thinking about my teenage years, being woke up in the middle of the night to take my dose of antibiotic for acne, it's just kind of wow to think back on that. However, then as I was in my 20s, and it's the stress of college and getting the real job and all of that, and alcohol exposure, I put on significant amount of weight. I'm talking, I was, and it was that unexplained. I'd even go to weight loss clinics. They'd do all my labs and even weigh me. I'd say, go to the next thing with the nurse. And they'd go, no, no, no. I'd be like, no, really, I weigh heavier than I look. My labs would come back perfectly normal / maybe a little elevated cholesterol. But I now know, folks, that if you have elevated cholesterol, it could be because your liver is trying to make some hormones. Or people go grain-free and their liver will kick off a bunch of cholesterol initially because they are going to say, hey, let's make sure you can make enough hormones. So these were all things that I experienced, and it's difficult when you know what you look like, okay, and you are doing everything you possibly can, and it's not working for you. I'm talking 1,200 calories, but I'd gain 3 pounds in a week, every week. So that's where I then looked into my own health. I became a raw foodist. That's real extreme, that's one area of the spectrum. However, I started to see my face clear, and I dropped 70 pounds very easily. It inspired me to go to naturopathic school, and that's where I, of course, learned more about many more things. It just so happened when I entered into medical school, Dr. Sandberg Lewis, who is my mentor in small intestine bacterial overgrowth, he had just finished writing a book, and he really only wrote a paragraph. And Dr. Seebecker read that book and that paragraph, and then she started asking to meet with him during office hours. And Dr. Sandberg Lewis had just been on sabbatical to write that book, but he came back the year that I started medical school. And so by way of him, getting his notoriety of writing his book, and then he was a popular guy to become, to intern with. He literally had a lottery. I won the lottery, and that's when as I started to understand SIBO, I started to say, oh my goodness, this is my whole picture from IBS to PCOS to migraines, extreme blackout migraines. All of these things now make sense. And as soon as I got on that path, and I'll tell you, it hasn't been easy. I've stumbled and learned many, many things. It has unearthed this new me. And now I might have some transient, and a regular cycle, but I might have some transient, blemishes that I can go, oh, look, it's day such and such of my cycle. So that's how I really can connect to the people probably listening and doing all of their hard work and research. As a Virgo myself, I like to do as much research as I can.
Wow, well, that's a really inspiring story, and you can certainly see that you've been through quite a bit, and it's just amazing when you finally, after so many years, you figure out, you stumble upon the actual reason for your pain, your symptom. You're like, this light bulb just kind of switches on. It's like, oh, that's why. So everything just kind of clears up, and you're on this road now where you know what to do, and it just doesn't feel so overwhelming anymore. So that's really amazing. When I figured out with PCOS exactly what was triggered my symptoms, it felt so much more easier to manage, and it didn't feel so scary anymore, because you now know that you can, if you do this, then your symptoms will be exacerbated. So it seems so much less daunting. And the point you said about how they just give you the birth control pill and all this medication, but it never actually works, and it just makes stuff, it just doesn't get to the root cause. I obviously went on the birth control pill, and that completely wreaked havoc for me. I went through bad digestive problems, and then I eventually came off it because my left calf got swollen, and I thought it was thrombosis. So that really scared me, and I was like, yeah, I'm not doing any of this stuff anymore. I need to find a natural way. So that's where I was doing all the research about PCOS and nutrition, just reversing it naturally, and it's possible. So it's really inspiring, and your story definitely is relatable. I think people can, relate to that story, which is, it's motivating and inspiring. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So I guess we might as well cover now what SIBO is, because I don't think a lot of people really know what it is. People know about the gut, but I guess they don't even know how important a healthy gut is. They don't associate it with, you know, taking care of your overall health. They don't know the links of how it might cause PCOS and other conditions. So can you just, you know, explain what SIBO is so people know?
Yeah, and one of the things that I like to start off with that I think a lot of people can relate to, whether you have children or you don't. I just even think of how as a girl, I was given a baby doll that you could put something in the mouth, and guess what? It came out the bottom. You know, and so, or we have our animals that we tend to, and we know exactly what's going on with them based on what's coming out of them. So I like to say, when did we stop talking about diapers? When do we come out of diapers and then it's like, zoop, in there? Now, don't get me wrong, there are households where it is talked about. And that's great. I think that's great. But in my household, it really wasn't talked about. Like I said, it was how long, and then my mom was like, you what? You know? So I think that's one of the things, and it's not fun to talk about. I get that too. And that's what's so funny that I landed in this, because I was a person that was like, you know, it's just, I deal with it. So that's a big thing. People don't know that they don't have to deal with it. They've given, you know, they've tried everything, whether they have diarrhea or they have constipation. They now land in that zone where they go with what they know in those urgents. But each person will have their urgent times where they're like, gosh, I wish I didn't have to worry about what my day is going to be like tomorrow with, you know, diarrhea. And gosh, I wish I could just get this out of me so I can have a good day tomorrow with constipation. So what happens is, and this is really important. So let's talk about IBS. IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome, right? Sounds familiar. PCOS, it's a syndrome. And that kind of means, well, we've found some common, commonalities, but we don't know exactly what the etiology or the root cause is, either for you or for everybody for this condition, because everyone is such a unique, beautiful snowflake, right? So that's where they're saying, okay, and there are these parameters, they're called the Rome criteria. And it's like, you have to have this, that, and whatever, you know, because we are trying to gain some kind of a consensus. But that didn't occur in everybody, or in some years it was missing a key component like bloating and pain, you know, or you had to have a change in your stool. And again, maybe somebody isn't thinking to go to their doctor and talk about something that might seem mundane to them, right? But, or they may live in a country, I've lived in Germany, where there's not a lot of water in the toilet bowl, right? And if I ask somebody here, does your stool float or sink? They might be in another country where there's not that water to judge, you know, or I'll say, okay, when you do flush, is there a residue left? Do you have to clean the bowl? I mean, we get detailed. I'm getting in the diapers because that's giving me so much information on, you know, do you see undigested food? What color is it? What's the status of your gallbladder? There are ranges of color. I'll say, sure, there's brown, there's dark brown, then there's really dark brown, then there's almost this tarry black that we need to talk about. Then there's this really light yellow, gray, almost white. Whoa, you know, we need to talk about that. Then there's form and function. You know, it's round balls like rabbit, or it comes out like a clean, smooth snake. Those are what they even call the Bristol stool scale. And all of that is giving us information. So let's kind of go back to a couple things I said. Let's say that your stool is floating. That can be an indication of fat malabsorption. Sometimes people also may even see like a sheen of oil slick, or just a, you know, residue floating on the water. Or they might see something floating around the stool itself, or mucus around the stool. There might be blood woven in it. I mean, there's a lot that we can gather from, again, what we're seeing. And that I will tell people, for example, if they're going to take digestive enzymes, I'll say, take your digestive enzymes until the stool stops floating. Then I would like you to not take the digestive enzymes, because again, I also don't want to give the body something that it should be doing itself for an overextended period of time, right? So I'll say, once it stops floating, and they can then tell me, oh yeah, I was able to fully come off, or no, it was still intermittent, I still needed those digestive enzymes. And there might be, like I said, more descriptions in there of more fat malabsorption that may then take me to the next level of using a more specific enzyme such as lipase, or assessing their bile status. Now, I do this with looking at some of their genetic, or really technically epigenetics. There are some enzymes that have some claim to fame. One of them is MTHFR. That just happens to be a pretty memorable acronym, but there are others too that lead me to say, oh, this person might have challenges with making adequate bile, which is made in the liver and then stored in the gallbladder. And with PCOS, some people they often have excess estrogen and low progesterone. They may have some imbalance in their thyroid, and that might be not frank thyroid, what your endocrinologist or your thyroid lab say that you're low thyroid, but you could have cellular hypothyroid. So at the level of where you need it most, your body isn't getting that thyroid action. And so that can be due to, I'll actually show a little picture here. There is a fat-soluble hormone / vitamin A and D, that's a cofactor for T3 at that cellular level. And then here's some drugs that can also affect. One I'll point out is cholecystiramine that some people might be on because of mold toxins. So I'm looking at also genetically or epigenetically, what are the influences that could trigger those genetics about their vitamin A and their vitamin D. So those are how the connection to, say, hormones, gallbladder, nutrition, and SIBO are all kind of interwoven and connected when we do get to the details of talking about our stool.
Wow, that was really interesting. Come to think of it, no one would think talking about like your stool would be like fascinating, but to think that you can actually gather really important information from that stuff it's just really fascinating.
Oh, and trust me, I have people they're like, you want some photos? And I'm like, no, I'm good. And then sometimes, what? Guess what? I get photos.
Oh. That's just, oh no. Can
right.
You imagine? You're like having your lunch, you just get
right, no. Can you imagine my life when I never wanted to talk about it to now where I'm like, yeah, sure, send me your stool.
Oh, how time changes. So how can SIBO be caused? Like, you talk about the environment,
right.
the epigenetics. What exactly can trigger it and cause it?
Well, we have Dr. Mark Pimentel and his entire team at the MAST program here at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles to thank for this, in addition to all of the researchers who are putting their effort in around the world. But his team in particular figured out, it took them 8 years to release this information. He announced it 2015 at Digestive Disease Week, which is this big international conference. And he was like the rock star of the entire conference, because he was able to prove that food poisoning or traveler's diarrhea can cause a dysfunction in our gut motility, most specifically with the small intestine. And that's what his team, they are gut motility specialists. And so that's really fascinating. So his team was able to develop a test that looks to see for this toxin that's released by the top 4 bacterial components, because it's not always bacterial, it can be viral, you could get a parasite, traveling in these countries, but if it was bacterial, we now can measure in the blood and look for this toxin called cytolethal distending toxin B. That's a mouthful. But they all release this toxin, okay, and we can say, all right, immune system, have you seen this toxin? And it can say yes or no, and or how much. Is it right now? Did it just recently happen? And then unfortunately, there is this molecular mimicry, which is what we're calling autoimmunity, where it looks so similar to self that our immune system unfortunately says, I got to do something about this. And it does that to this motor nerve called vinculin. And so vinculin is a part of this. It's called the migrating motor complex. And the migrating motor complex is the cleaning wave, or I call this cleaning the countertops, so that you have not dirty countertops. Now, let's say you're going to the kitchen to make a sandwich just here and there. Do you have to wipe it down with bleach, get it super duper sanitized every single time? No, maybe you could make a quick meal. But if you're going to come and make chicken or curry, get into a meal, you better wash that countertop and all of your utensils, right? Because again, that susceptibility to a food poisoning can be left there. And so that is a kind of a similar situation here, where we need to keep this migrating motor complex moving. Now, there's all of this information, and there are plenty of things we can do to have that migrating motor complex move. A lot of them will focus on what's called phase 3 of the small intestine, which is where this overgrowth happens. So what they did was they found out that in a lot of people with IBS, they would do this breath test, and they would find that there was an overabundance of bacteria in the wrong compartment. These are not bad bacteria. These are just bacteria that are like, oh, I'm in the wrong room. If they just went through the double doors, they'd be in the right ballroom, which is the large intestine. But somehow they're trapped in this area, and this is maybe some people they feel good in the morning, but by mid-afternoon or the evening, they're 3, 4, 6, 9 months pregnant, feeling in their belly, or visibly even showing it in their belly. And that can literally be the gases that these bacteria are producing. Then there's they're not technically bacteria, they're called archaea, and they release methane. And methane are tricky buggers because they will actually just stop things from moving, and they can actually make things go backwards. It's called retropulsion. So that's one of the reasons why I actually look upstream from the small intestine and assess the stomach, because when the stomach is actually phase 1 of the migrating motor complex, and if that's not having the proper pH to empty, you're not going to get even the beginning of that migrating motor complex wave. And so a lot of things might even focus on, we got to get that, small intestine area clean, but I'm like, you got to get on the on-ramp first before you get into traffic. So that's why I am very passionate about assessing for stomach acid production. And once I look at that, then I can move on down the tube, and a lot of things actually balance themselves out, which is really exciting that I've learned in the last few years.
Wow, interesting. So what are you kind of address some of the symptoms someone might be experiencing, but can you just provide now clearly so people can just get a whole bunch of symptoms so they can...
Oh yeah, sure. Okay, so you can have, I call it you're so bloated you want to unzip your belly, men, women, men will even say, I feel 9 months pregnant. That's funny. Okay. Yeah. Sometimes it's water retention, excessive thirst, craving for nut butters. That's an interesting keynote I've had. They'll say, oh my gosh, that cashew butter just keeps calling me from the fridge. I ate a whole jar today. Callings for nuts and sweets. That I don't know, that's a unique keynote. And I do believe it's because of the saturated fat. Methane really like fat. They eat it up. So there can be a lot of brain fog. So people will refer to this term as leaky gut. And the medical term is intestinal permeability. And technically there's a study that showed that, yes, 50% of people with SIBO had leaky gut. However, when we got the bacteria out of the way, clean the countertops, right? Only 25% of that 50% still had leaky gut after 30 days. So I typically get the bacteria out of the way. I say, clean the room out. Then we bring in the new furniture. We wait to see, do we really need to treat for leaky gut? But leaky gut symptoms, say for example, somebody is doing a lactulose breath test or glucose, but most commonly here in the US, it's a lactulose breath test to measure for this. If they just have gut symptoms, like they are running to the bathroom because they have loose stool, they are constipated for 3 days after from taking that test. They're sitting there, and as they do the 3-hour test, not fun, their abdomen is growing. They're going, look, here it is right here. Okay, if it's mainly all GI symptoms, or reflux is another symptom. Upset stomach, abdominal pain, cramping. There can be a plethora of, whatever a lot of people have gone to a gastroenterologist for. There's even some overlap if somebody has an inflammatory bowel disease called Crohn's. There's a study that shows 45% of Crohn's patients also have SIBO. So that can be just kind of, could be a mimicker of things too, which is why the MAST program, Pimentel team came, they feel so passionate about this test called IBS SMART test here in the US, because if you can get this test and show that it is in fact because of a food poisoning or traveler's diarrhea, it is very high probability, now 98%, that that's what you have. You have IBS. And it can reduce costs significantly for people who are still undergoing and investigating their, I see people who are in and out of the emergency room even, still trying to find out what's wrong with them. And so sorry, I just had to segue to kind of mention all of that.
Awesome. No, that was interesting. Thanks for touching all those symptoms, because I think it will help people to be like, oh, okay, I'm suffering from this, or just to go get checked out. But can you address, because there's so many different types of PCOS and different causes, what exactly is the connection? Like what is the connection?
Oh, what is the connection with SIBO and PCOS? Yeah, I'm making a big connection too. Okay, so there can be I call it the thyroid adrenal gonad complex. So we know there can be this excess in androgens with higher testosterone. We can have an excess in estrogens. Those excess estrogens can come from having been put on the birth control pill. And now it can be because of the amount of environmental toxins that are in our environment. So you're put on the birth control pill, which naturally raises what's called your sex hormone binding globulin. And then you're in this environment, even just sitting in a car, re-breathing in all of the exhaust from all of the cars. I'm here in LA, not that I don't drive, I'm not exposed to this daily. So that's one of those things where that can be influencing the bacteria. The other thing is, if you have SIBO, you could have bacteria that are actually making things that are so similar to our hormones that can be contributing to your balance being off. So the endocrinologist or your gynecologist, they don't understand, or they read. I just had a patient yesterday who said their gynecologist said, these labs are wrong. This can't be happening because you still have a cycle or you don't have a cycle, right? I see a lot of people with amenorrhea, and yet I check their sex hormone binding globulin and it's extremely high. Now, again, like I said, one of the reasons it can be high is by being on the birth control pill. So what happens is this shifts our free androgen index, and it turns people into a catabolic state where you're breaking things down instead of rebuilding, which is anabolic. All right. And that's where, yes, with PCOS being more androgen dominant, it's tricky. And that's where in my story, I was like, oh my goodness, all of this is related to my gut and my thyroid being not quite officially off, but now functionally. And in this day and age, I know I had thyroid dysfunction. Well, 20% of our thyroid conversion happens in the gut from T4 to T3. So again, that can be something where we're working with a practitioner, they're giving you thyroid support, or you're actually on medications and you haven't cleaned up your gut, or you're trying to clean up your gut and it's just not working for you. Or you could be put on some, I see this kind of often in terms of like adrenal support, you're put on a B complex and everybody swears by a B complex. And yet I actually take people off of many complexes because I want to isolate how they respond to, say, one complex. And again, I really heavily rely on using the raw data from 23andMe. Now, I know there's some opinions about 23andMe, and I appreciate that. I don't get into the data they're mine. I just want the raw data they provide to upload into a software program called Strategene. So when you say, I'm so glad you brought that up, that there's so many ways this can present, I really like to look at the Strategene report because I can see, oh, look, this is their MTHFR status. This is their propensity to make bile. Bile is essential on getting these estrogens out of our stool. If you're not having a bowel movement, it doesn't matter what birth control pill, what diet, how much celery juice you're drinking, if you can't get the stuff out, you know? So I have even seen people who have been through every round of treatment for methane, because that's a tricky one, and we've just used ox bile from an ox. And then all of a sudden, I've seen it within a week, they were moving daily. And what do you know? Their acne reduced significantly. I have one case of someone who had the acne, and took photos daily, bless her heart. And she officially, I typically don't see people having low stomach acid. I've technically seen 5 people who really have low stomach acid. Okay, that's another thing I'm passionate about, is that if you're presumptively taking hydrochloric acid and you have gut or gut dysfunction, it doesn't feel right, please consider stopping taking your HCl. That is because I really actually see people having high stomach acid. 90% of the stomachs I test actually have high stomach acid. However, in this case, she did have low stomach acid. She began taking hydrochloric acid, and we just watched her face completely change. We watched her cycle just come right back in. I mean, it was just like, it was as if it erased all the, and it's like you can't erase it, but it was like that diagnosis didn't really exist. And so that's what brings me joy in what I do.
Amazing. That it definitely, when you see these changes in people, it really just makes you feel like something's it's just, I don't know, it's just amazing when you're working with people and you're just helping them. It just makes worthwhile, and you see the results. It's amazing. So
and I will just say really quick, sorry, because celery juice did change my life. So I'm not anti-celery juice. Over 10 years ago, someone told me to start drinking celery juice, and it changed my life. So I have seen the photos. For anybody who, if it changed your life, I am so happy for you.
Yeah, because sometimes all these things start trending, and like people don't know, do we believe it, do we not believe it, because there's just so much going on that people just are overwhelmed with all the information. But I'm sure there's a lot of benefits to it.
Of course, and the reason why I suspect that it is that I think that there is this stomach acid, the high stomach acid, that and this trend in intermittent fasting and keto, I find that in high stomach acid too. Just side note.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. So if someone's suffering with like PCOS and SIBO, how does someone go about, what's the first step for them? What do they first do?
Sure. So it's absolutely essential, I think it's important to have a breath test if you haven't had a breath test. So like I mentioned, there is a glucose breath test. There is a lactulose, not lactose, lactulose. And that requires a prescription from a doctor. Of course, there are, I believe, areas online where people can get access to these things. And ideally, it's a test that's 3 hours long versus a shorter or 90-minute. And again, I'm just speaking to the researchers and the amount of time that I've spent with this condition, with this. I call it because it's just stating the obvious. It's SIBO, right? We're just stating what we found. Not really a condition. Do you see how I caught myself there? So yeah, how high your levels are. So physiologically, the body can handle, back to the countertops, it can handle about 5 parts per million of bacteria being left behind, let's say, not going to affect our sandwich making. But if it gets over 20 parts per million, then that's going to affect physiology. That's going to affect your absorption. And then if it gets higher and higher, it's going to start crowding that tube. So crowding that tube could then cause distension. It could cause pain in some people who have what we call visceral hypersensitivity. And and then it could also affect the function. It could cause things to go backwards, or it could cause a cramping, just kind of like the circuits are off, right? So it depends on the amount of, like, I call it lint in the dryer vent. If you kept the lint in the dryer vent, that is a potential fire for your house. So you've got to keep cleaning out that lint, right? And that's what that migrating motor complex is doing. Now, I also mentioned, I believe it is essential, and I test all of my patients for this. Is there a reason behind your food poisoning and or traveler's diarrhea? Because if there is an elevation in those antibodies, this person is now, I know they are now 5 times more susceptible to another food poisoning or traveler's diarrhea for about 5 to 10 years. So that's also my story, is that I kept getting food poisoning. Now I have what I skip the record. My gut will skip the record. And then if you don't know how to get and put the record back on, then you're going to just spin in a hamster wheel of constantly having to treat yourself and always having to watch what you're eating, because it could cause symptoms. So I think that's really important, because the people that then have this answer and go, oh, that's why. Now, I will say, when that test came out in 2015, I was so excited. And then I sat down with Dr. Pimentel and I'm like, look at my stack of positives. I was so sad. I was like, but they've been to Machu Picchu in Mexico and they remember, and they had it out both ends. And, I was like, isn't this the explanation? And he says, well, look, out of 100 people that went to the wedding and they got exposed to salmonella chicken, about 10 of those people are going to get these positive antibodies. So if you and your friend, spouse, whoever go to a potluck, or, and you got something, and they have the rot gut, right? And they go, we ate the same thing, but you didn't, right? So that could be another reasoning. Again, that was my story, where I'm like, oh, so I am more susceptible. Now, those people need to be treated differently and might need to be on a different plan. They might need presumptive treatment. They're going on a cruise. They're going to a third world country. We want them to be on some prophylactic, let's prevent this. And actually, there is a case of someone who resolved their SIBO, and then they continued to take Xifaxan, which is the pharmaceutical drug, onto a trip. The entire bus tour got sick with a gut bug, and this person didn't. And it was a perfect example of how much of a setback that human could have even had. We're talking, again, back into the emergency room, back into this whole system, dollar signs, that it's a really profound thing to know about your history. Now, it can also be disappointing when the test originally said inconclusive, which means, okay, we're back to diagnosis of exclusion, which some people can get also with PCOS, right? It's like, well, you have some of the picture, but not all of the picture. Oh, well, you have these, cysts in your ovaries, but you don't have the high cholesterol or this, or you're not overweight and you don't have the Hirsutism, and it's like, well, what am I? You're trying to put you in this box, and you're like this, squeeze thing, you're being pulled in all these different directions. So so I feel like that's when I started looking into the sex hormone binding globulin, because I was like, oh, wait a minute, look, this person isn't technically because of their food poisoning. And actually now the test is much more sensitive and specific. So some of those people, I started writing the numbers down, because I was like, well, wait a minute. And he has now since shown, he's like, well, that was for me to say 98% specific. If you're 70%, your numbers could have been, and that's why I was like, oh, I'm so glad, because now that story of that trip to Mexico, or wherever they had gone, may indeed make sense in that individual. Okay. The other thing why I say, all right, I often see people who have been through the algorithm of SIBO and have done a lot of the treatments. And so I know some people are just new to it. The initial treatment, if you're in with conventional medicine, meaning the hospital gastrointestinal doctor, would be some antibiotics. And depending on that doctor's opinion and research and knowledge of the condition, they may give 1 or 2, and they may give which antibiotic they choose, which means a broad spectrum antibiotic, which just knocks out everything, or this particular drug, which I'm referring to, is Xifaxan, or the generic is rifaximin, and that is taking out the guys that are good guys, wrong compartment. They just go, sorry folks, you can't be here, we're gonna close you down. And then interestingly, when it hits the large intestine, this antibiotic becomes a probiotic, and it starts to repopulate the large intestine with lactobacillus and bifido. So the technical term is eubiotic. It's meaning we're taking away that which shouldn't be there, and they're not bad guys, and we're just going, here you go, we need more in this compartment. Whereas if you're taking a regular or a broad spectrum antibiotic for pneumonia, a sinus infection, that's doing that whole wipeout, right? And now the current consensus is, as of this last year in gut microbiome conferences that I attend, they are saying we don't recommend probiotics with that broad spectrum antibiotic either. I think I'm going to surprise some people with this. So I actually recommend stopping all probiotics. I recommend stopping all fermented foods. Yes, all fermented foods, because that can be contributing to your lint in the dryer vent / traffic in that traffic jam. Okay. And it's not forever, but it can be. Some people are like, wow, I can't believe it. And so they just have it every once in a while, but it's not kombucha in the morning and this and kimchi, like all day, every day. I'm not anti-fermenting. I'm just, how much is enough of a good thing? Okay. So those are really important things where I just say, hey, if I can take out that probiotic so that I can clear the decks here and see if that's helping. And then if I can get to that stomach acid function and make sure that's going well, that is what I really focus on. And that test is called a Heidelberg test. And people can go to phcapsule.com. It is a website from the 90s. It is not fancy, but there is a referral tab. So for those doctors who have purchased their Heidelberg machine through Heidelberg Medical Group, they may be listed. It's international even, I believe. And that is this test of a radio frequency capsule, which is about the size of a supplement, that is attached to a string. And I recommend my patients go to YouTube and put in Heidelberg test. Typically, this particular video comes up of a gentleman I send people to here in Los Angeles or Torrance, California. His name is Dr. Ozawa. And she's a small framed female there going, I'm here to see my low stomach acid. And lo and behold, she doesn't have low stomach acid. And so I like that, so people can get that exposure to and see. It's 15-minute long. They can see what it looks like, the procedure of swallowing the string. And you actually have the string attached to your face, and that capsule dangles in your stomach. And they're looking on a monitor to see how fast your stomach acid cells respond to bringing a agent that they give you, which is like baking soda and water. They look to see how quickly your stomach acid cells re-acidify. So that's an important test that I have found being profoundly important as to like, how do I get that migrating motor complex moving? How do I get somebody able to eat all the foods that they want to eat and not have so many food sensitivities? Because what I've found is that if chicken, for example, lands in that stomach and it's not being broken down properly, either too high or too low stomach acid, it's not getting all of these amino acids that we need to nourish our neurotransmitters, our melatonin, and get the good sleep we need. And so all that happens is the immune system goes, chicken. Oh no, I go, chicken. Our stomach is the size of our fist. And I go, it just goes, chicken. And so if we can get chicken, a protein, properly broken down by the right pH balance, then it's like, oh, okay, phenylalanine, tryptophan, thank you. We know what to do with these things. And so I've seen, actually, quite frankly, very quickly, within 2 to 4 weeks, gas levels. I can tell you a breath test where their hydrogen was over 200, their methane was over 80, and that would have taken maybe multiple rounds of, and it had been taking multiple rounds of pharmaceutical antibiotics. And we addressed the stomach in 2 weeks, they went and had their repeat breath test, and they came back with, technically, per the consensus, a negative breath test. And so that was a insightful tool for me, because I then test the blood to see why those cells, it's called parietal cells, why do they make too much gastric acid? And then there's intrinsic factor, which is how we absorb our B12. So that's how I came back to this, people will say you need a B complex or you need specific methylfolate, maybe even. But if people aren't getting and breaking their food down or even absorbing B12 properly, and they may have an autoimmune reasoning for that, then that's one of the things that if I, again, can address that and fix it or find it, in fact, it can be huge, a big part of the picture that might be overlapping with some PCOS symptoms as well.
Wow. That was just so interesting. Wow. so much information, but it actually, you start learning and understanding how the body works and how important it is to be breaking down your food, so it's not your body doesn't start attacking it and you don't feel bloated and you're not seeing food in your stool and stuff like that. Because if you're not breaking it down, like you said, you're not getting the nutrients, it's not going to, for example, your muscles, and you're not getting all that stuff to be, rebuilding and just nourishing your body. So that is one of, the key factors in having a healthy gut. So that's really interesting. And you mentioned before about having women with PCOS could have high sex hormone binding globulin, which could be as a result of the birth control pill too. What are some things women might be able to do at home and with food and stuff to lower that hormone?
Well, I have been working on this really hard. So let me tell you, because I originally and have worked with a gynecologist who did work in this for 40 plus years, honestly. Okay. So, and just saw, and he started in the 60s, and he saw birth control come into the population. Then he saw migraines and fibroids, and he just saw this whole thing, this picture happen, and he was taking out uteruses and big old fibroids, and he's like, what is going on here? And was able to track even migraines with this sex hormone binding globulin. So I will say that what I have been taught has been all pharmaceutical, all anabolic steroids, even, just being very direct with you, at a very low dose. And that is the one thing that I have seen the sex hormone binding globulin drop consistently. So I met him while he was a keynote speaker at an anti-aging convention, conference, and I was there learning about thyroid. And then I watched this video about this woman, and it had me in tears. I'm in the front row, thankfully nobody could see me, but I was like, these are my patients. And I had just gotten my sex hormone binding globulin tested, which was random. And I'm like, I get it. He was saying how the environmental toxins are what our liver secretes this binding protein. So in terms of like PCOS and having elevated testosterone, what I look for is that it's this imbalance in terms of like, what is our body trying to say with this estrogen dominance? And again, like we have to look at each picture. Do we need to raise up progesterone a bit? Do we need to get the gallbladder and liver and that production? I find some people genetically, they don't have some of the tools like phosphatidylcholine. Our bile is 70% phosphatidylcholine. And so they might have from 2 SNPs from their parents, that it's like, look, my body just doesn't make about 30% less phosphatidylcholine. So if I know that, I can say, oh, look, let's give your body some phosphatidylcholine. I call it pulse supplementing for a time period. See how, oh, look, your stool's not floating anymore. Look, you're digesting fats better. And oh, look, that acne is reducing by your second cycle. That's fantastic, or lack thereof. I know some people have a lack thereof, but we all have a ebb and flow of a cycle happening hormonally. So I have been looking at boron I am looking, so, and again, we always want to be careful when we get excited about something to then not go out and go too high, because there's always going to be a balanced nutrient that we're going to want to, but boron is associated with lowering the sex hormone binding globulin. As I'm sure many of your listeners are doing, is eating as cleanly as we possibly can, right? And that's the reason why I want people to be breaking their food down, because I know what it costs to eat this clean. You know, we want everything. That's your life insurance. I call it. I like to flip it and say it's your life insurance to be eating this well. But let's extract the goods, right? So that's important in terms of, and doing the best you can. You know, not everybody can, not everyone can afford, if you're as sticking to as clean as you can, right? The clean versus dirty dozen, etc. And celery is one of those dirty ones, by the way. So when you can, if you're doing celery juice, ensure that it's organic and ensure that it's cleaned really, really well. That's one of my big things. I follow food safety news because I'm a food poisoning nerd. And let me tell you, I'm not going to be eating romaine lettuce this year in the United States. No, no. So those are things that, and then there are herbs, there are herbal, but like proprietary blends. I use one that's called testosterone quench, you know, like it's like, let's make sure that our body is processing the testosterone or androgens well. And a lot of that has to do with gut function. I believe, I think a lot of people agree with that, but it's the, how do we get our gut to function optimally with PCOS? That's the tricky part. And that's why I'm so glad we're able to talk about SIBO today.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I think
Yeah.
people, like, when it comes to hormones, it is overwhelming, because you just think, oh, this is high, this is low. Well, how the hell do I fix all this stuff? It's just, and then you hear, oh, yeah, eat clean, and then people do it, but then they're like, oh, how long does it take? And it's all about being consistent and just making sure you're feeding your body, you know, well, and making sure that the gut is working healthy, like it's working optimally, like you've been talking about this whole time, that the gut is really important. So thank you for covering all that. But lastly, is there any, you know, what's your biggest tip or number one piece of advice that you would give for our listeners to, you know, make some changes and heal themselves?
Yeah, like I said, I think my biggest tip is don't assume you need stomach acid. Do not assume that HCl is helping you. And quite frankly, I have had people say, oh, and with all due professional courtesy and respect to any person who's trying to help another human being, I am just saying that if your client, whatever, says, I don't know that this is going so well for me, or I'm getting reflux, or I have worse bloating, or I say stop immediately, because that is not, oh, push through, that's just die off, or, you know, it is a sign that, if not even more likely, that you may even have an excess production of stomach acid. And I have tested many people, and it has not been due to H. pylori. I actually have a theory, and I'm for my future Nobel Prize, because I'm like, we haven't looked at anything since H. pylori since 1989. I'm like, what else could be causing this stomach acid disruption? Okay, so that's my biggest, I'm very passionate about it, is that some people, they just stop taking that HCl, and you may even have to look at your supplement and see if betaine HCl is in your digestive enzyme, or if you are taking frank betaine HCl with pepsin or just HCl. Try taking a break, and let me tell you, I've had people feel better immediately. Sometimes it might take a few days, but yes, I'm passionate about that. Thank you for asking, because I like to get that message out.
Awesome. Because I think a lot of people do take like digestive enzymes, and I guess with supplements in general, like we know they can help, but like you keep saying, like you could take something can become worse just because it's good. It can affect you negatively. Just because we think something's good and it is good, it can have a negative effect, basically. So thank you for sharing that, because I think a lot of people, you know, want to take it, but that thing might be causing more problems. So,
I've seen it often, and I'll just say real quick, I'll say, look, if you can stop all of your supplements, all of your supplements, only take essential medications that you've been prescribed, then we look at the stomach, and then I call it reset the stomach, because out of 100, I've only seen 5 normal or optimal functioning stomachs. So I say, look, if we put drug, supplement, food into this dysregulated stomach, we're getting static. So let's give it 2 weeks, kind of try and reset the stomach, and then I'm going to go shopping back in all of your supplements. I want to bring back in that or one thing at a time, and have you go, oh, wow. I've had patients where they go, oh my gosh, that B complex was giving me anxiety. And I'm like, let's just make a little bit of a shuffle. And that's the other thing I wanted to say quickly. I tell all of my patients there's a hormone microbe shuffle. I'm showing my hands like a balance. You get to the microbes and you start to shuffle that. You're going, oh, I'm working on my gut health. And guess what? Your hormones shuffle. And then you work on your hormones, and then your gut shuffles. And so I like to go, look, you're going like this, and we want to just try and get a nice little ebb and flow. And you go, oh, that's that day of my cycle, or oh, that was my mood, or yeah, I'm a little stressed today, but it wasn't the broccoli.
I had something else to say, but now because that was just interesting. I like the way you drive stuff. It just makes it a lot more easier to understand, because I feel that this stuff is pretty complex for like the normal person. So when you include stuff like that, it really helps people understand stuff better. So thank you for making it easy to listen to and understand. But
my pleasure.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed this talk. I really learned a lot, and I'll be paying attention to all of the stuff you've mentioned and making sure my gut is working as well as it should be. So thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you.